something shifted in California this week that most people haven't fully processed yet. PepsiCo just announced they're shutting down a major Frito-Lay production facility in the state, and the governor's office has been scrambling to respond. This isn't about one factory closing. It's about what that closure represents in a much larger pattern we've been watching unfold across the state for the past several years. When a company the size of PepsiCo makes a move like this, it's rarely impulsive. These decisions get made in boardrooms months, sometimes years, in advance. They run the numbers, they model the scenarios, and when they finally pull the trigger, it's because staying put no longer makes financial sense. The question we need to ask isn't just why Frito-Lay is leaving, it's who else has been quietly running those same calculations. Because if California's business environment has changed enough to push out a snack food manufacturer with deep roots in the American market, then we're looking at something that goes well beyond chips and corporate tax rates. This is about the long-term economic trajectory of the country's largest state economy and what it means when that trajectory starts pointing companies toward the exit. The Frito-Lay facility in question employed hundreds of workers, and for those families, this isn't an abstract economic discussion. It's about mortgages, car payments, health insurance, and whether they'll need to uproot their lives to follow the jobs elsewhere. But zoom out for a moment, and you start to see this closure fitting into a broader mosaic of corporate departures that have been quietly reshaping California's economy over the past decade. We're not talking about speculation here. We're talking about documented relocations, publicly announced headquarters moves, and a steady stream of businesses either scaling back their California operations or leaving the state entirely. Let's establish some context. California has always been expensive. That's not new. The state has carried premium costs for real estate, labor, and regulatory compliance for generations. And for a long time, businesses accepted those costs because the benefits outweighed them. Access to ports, proximity to major population centers, a highly educated workforce, venture capital ecosystems, and the cultural cachet of operating in California made the expense worthwhile. Silicon Valley didn't become Silicon Valley by accident. The entertainment industry didn't consolidate in Los Angeles because it was cheap. These clusters formed because California offered something other states couldn't replicate. But something has changed in the calculus, and it's happening gradually enough that most people aren't connecting the individual data points into a coherent picture. The Frito-Lay closure comes on the heels of several other high-profile corporate decisions. In recent years, we've seen Tesla move its headquarters to Texas. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise relocated to Texas. Oracle shifted to Texas. Charles Schwab moved to Texas. CBRE Group, one of the world's largest commercial real estate firms, moved to Dallas. These aren't small startups making opportunistic moves. These are established, Fortune 500 companies with deep California roots, and they're making deliberate strategic decisions to relocate their corporate centers of gravity. Each company has its own stated reasons, but common themes keep emerging in these announcements. Cost of living, regulatory environment, tax structure, housing affordability for employees, permitting timelines, energy costs. When you hear the same concerns voiced repeatedly across different industries, it stops being coincidence and starts being pattern. Now, California's government has historically responded to these concerns by emphasizing the state's unique advantages. They point to the innovation ecosystem, the quality of life, the climate, the diversity of talent, and the sheer scale of the California market. These aren't invalid points. California's economy, if it were a standalone nation, would rank as one of the largest in the world. The state generates enormous wealth, drives technological innovation, and remains home to some of the most valuable companies ever created. But here's where the tension emerges. The California that thrives is increasingly concentrated in specific sectors and specific geographic areas. The tech wealth of San Francisco and Silicon Valley, the entertainment money in Los Angeles, the biotech corridors of San Diego. These prosperity zones exist alongside regions that have been struggling for years with unemployment, poverty, and economic stagnation. The Central Valley, where agriculture dominates and water politics dictate survival, operates in a completely different economic reality than the coastal cities. The Frito-Lay facility that's closing is located in an area that doesn't benefit from the tech boom prosperity. These manufacturing jobs represented stable, middle-class employment in a region where those opportunities have been shrinking. When PepsiCo made this decision, they would have analyzed every factor. Labor costs, certainly. California's minimum wage has been rising, and the state has been aggressive about expanding worker protections, mandatory benefits, and overtime rules. For a large employer operating on thin margins in food manufacturing, these costs add up quickly. Then there's energy. California's electricity rates are among the highest in the nation, and they've been climbing. A manufacturing facility running production lines around the clock consumes enormous amounts of power, and when your competitors in other states are paying a fraction of your energy costs, that gap becomes unsustainable over time. But let's dig deeper into the regulatory environment, because this is where the conversation often gets oversimplified. Critics of California regulation tend to paint it as purely bureaucratic obstruction, while defenders argue it's necessary protection for workers, consumers, and the environment. The reality, as usual, is more nuanced. California does have some of the most comprehensive regulatory frameworks in the country. Environmental standards are stricter. Labor protections are more robust. Consumer safety requirements are more detailed. In many cases, California regulations eventually become national standards because the state's market is so large that companies find it easier to comply nationwide rather than maintain separate product lines. This is called the California effect, and it's been a real phenomenon in industries from automotive emissions to chemical safety. However, there's a difference between regulation that drives innovation and regulation that simply increases costs without proportional benefits. California has struggled with regulatory overlap, where businesses need to navigate multiple agencies with sometimes conflicting requirements. The permitting process for new construction or facility modifications can stretch for years, and the unpredictability of that timeline makes planning difficult. Companies need to know when they can open, when they can expand, when they can modify operations. When those timelines become uncertain or excessively long, it creates risk that shows up in financial modeling. And when a company is deciding where to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a new facility or expansion, they're going to choose the location where they can predict outcomes and control timelines. The tax situation adds another layer of complexity. California has a progressive income tax structure with top rates among the highest in the nation. For high-earning individuals, this is a significant consideration, and we've seen affluent Californians relocating to states like Nevada, Florida, and Texas that have no state income tax. For corporations, California's tax rates aren't dramatically out of line with other large states, but the overall tax burden, when you combine state, local, and various fees and assessments, can be substantial. More importantly, many of the states competing for California businesses are offering aggressive incentive packages. Tax credits, subsidized land, workforce training programs, expedited permitting, infrastructure improvements. These aren't small gestures. States like Texas, Tennessee, Arizona, and Nevada have made business recruitment a core economic strategy, and they're willing to invest significant resources to attract major employers. When the governor's office responded to the Frito-Lay announcement, the initial statements followed a predictable pattern: disappointment at the decision, commitment to working with affected employees, emphasis on California's ongoing strengths and the administration's efforts to improve the business climate. These are the things you say when you're caught between competing political pressures. On one side, there's a progressive base that wants to see strong labor protections, environmental standards, and corporate accountability. On the other side, there's a growing recognition that if businesses keep leaving, the tax base that funds all of California's programs will erode. It's a genuinely difficult position. and it's not clear there's a politically viable path that satisfies both constituencies. What makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. California is facing a substantial budget deficit. The state's finances have always been volatile because they're heavily dependent on capital gains taxes from wealthy individuals, and when the stock market or tech sector contracts, revenues drop sharply. The current deficit estimates run into the tens of billions of dollars, forcing difficult conversations about spending cuts and revenue increases. In this context, every major employer that leaves takes with them not just the jobs, but the tax revenue, the supplier ecosystem, the ancillary economic activity that surrounds any large operation. A Frito-Lay factory doesn't just employ the people inside the building. It supports trucking companies, packaging suppliers, maintenance contractors, food service vendors, and all the businesses that those workers patronize with their paychecks. The ripple effects of these closures are easy to underestimate. When a facility shuts down, the immediate job losses are visible and get reported. But the secondary effects unfold over months and years. The local tax base shrinks. School enrollment may drop if families move away. Commercial real estate that served the workforce sits empty. The community's economic momentum stalls. These are the kinds of changes that transform a town or region gradually, and by the time the full impact is clear, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. You can't just will an employer back into existence. Once the infrastructure is dismantled, the workforce dispersed, and the institutional knowledge lost, rebuilding requires starting from scratch. Now, it would be unfair to present this as a one-sided story of California decline. The state continues to attract enormous investment in certain sectors. Venture capital funding in California still dwarfs most other states. The entertainment industry remains centered in Los Angeles, despite some production moving to places with better tax incentives. The state's universities continue to produce world-class talent and cutting-edge research. California's cultural influence globally remains immense. These are real strengths, and they matter. But here's the question that deserves serious consideration. Can an economy thrive long-term if it's bifurcated between extremely high-value knowledge work and service jobs, with the middle-tier manufacturing and skilled trades employment continuing to erode? The manufacturing sector has been declining in California for decades. This isn't new, and it reflects broader trends in the American economy. But other states have managed to maintain or even grow manufacturing employment by adapting to new industries, investing in workforce development, and creating competitive operating environments. California's manufacturing employment as a percentage of total jobs has fallen more sharply than the national average. Some of this is inevitable. The state's economy has evolved towards services and technology, but some of it represents jobs that didn't have to leave, opportunities that could have been retained with different policy choices. The political dynamics around these issues have become increasingly polarized, suggesting that California needs to make its business environment more competitive often gets characterized as a call to gut environmental protections or exploit workers. Defending California's regulatory approach often gets dismissed as ignoring economic reality. The truth is that there's a version of California policy that maintains strong protections while also streamlining processes, reducing redundancy, and creating more predictable timelines. The state has actually attempted some reforms in this direction. There have been efforts to consolidate, expedite certain types of projects, and provide more regulatory clarity. But the scale of these reforms hasn't matched the scale of the competitive pressure California faces. One factor that doesn't get discussed enough is housing. California's housing crisis affects everything else in the state's economy. When workers can't afford to live near their jobs, employers struggle to attract and retain talent. When housing costs consume 50, 60, even 70% of someone's income, consumer spending in other areas contracts. When young people can't imagine ever affording a home, they leave for other states where homeownership seems achievable. The causes of California's housing shortage are complex and involve decades of restrictive zoning, environmental review processes that allow endless litigation, community opposition to new development, and geographic constraints. But whatever the causes, the effect is clear. California has underbuilt housing for a generation, and the resulting scarcity drives costs that make the entire state less competitive. The Frito-Lay closure should be understood in this broader context. It's not just about one factory. It's a signal about the cumulative weight of all these factors. When a company as large and established as PepsiCo decides the costs of operating in California outweigh the benefits, it suggests that the balance has tipped in a fundamental way. And the concerning part is that these decisions tend to accelerate. When one company leaves, it makes it slightly easier for the next one to justify the same move. The business ecosystem shifts, the political momentum changes, the narrative about California's economic direction evolves. What should concern every Californian, regardless of political perspective, is what happens if this trend continues. The state's social programs, its universities, its infrastructure investments all depend on tax revenue generated by a thriving economy. If the tax base contracts because employers relocate, the state faces increasingly difficult choices. Cut services, raise taxes on those who remain, or some painful combination of both. And those choices themselves can accelerate the departure cycle, creating a feedback loop that becomes difficult to escape. The governor's response to this situation will be telling. Does the administration treat this as an isolated incident, offer some assistance to displaced workers, and move on? Or does it prompt a more fundamental reassessment of what's working and what isn't in California's economic policy? There are models for how states can reinvent themselves. North Carolina transformed from a tobacco and textiles economy into a research and biotech hub. Georgia evolved from agriculture into a logistics and film production center. Pennsylvania has been working to transition from steel manufacturing toward healthcare and technology. These transformations don't happen by accident. They require sustained commitment, strategic investment, and sometimes difficult compromises. California has advantages that most states would envy. The question is whether those advantages are being leveraged effectively or squandered through policy choices that prioritize short-term political considerations over long-term economic sustainability. And that's not a partisan statement. It's a practical observation based on what we're seeing unfold in real time. The Frito-Lay closure is one data point, but when you line up all the data points from the past several years, a picture emerges that should prompt serious reflection about where California is headed and whether that's where Californians actually want to go.